Welcome back, everyone. We are here joined today for a great fireside chat with Brian Fox. So Brian Fox is a programmer, an entrepreneur, a consultant, an author, and he is a member of the Free Software Foundation and that movement. He was the original author of the GNU Bash shell and maintained GNU Emacs as well. He also built the first online banking software for Wells Fargo, and he's currently the CEO of Opus Logica Incorporated. Brian, thanks for being here today.
Are you kidding? It's a blast to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, man. Great. Yeah. So the way this format's going to work here is we're going to actually have a one-on-one fireside chat in this video session. And then audience members, you're encouraged to ask questions as we chat here. And we'll be picking questions off a list from the audience as we chat. So some of the questions will come from me, and some of the questions will come from the audience. We'll have a mix of both.
Great.
So Brian, why don't we start off by just telling the audience a little bit about yourself? I'd love to hear about your background, how you got started programming, and maybe a little bit about your career history. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I was born in Brookline, Mass, which is basically it's part of Boston. My dad's a physicist and a musician. I'm also a musician, but not a physicist. And when I was growing up, you know, computers really didn't exist except if you were in a giant company like Bolt, Beranek and Newman, where my dad worked. And in our basement, we had stashed away a teletype machine, you know, ding, 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 clackety, clack, clack, clack. And that talked over a 110 baud modem back to Bolt, Beranek and Newman. I used to go down and type on it. And there was the G key has the word bell written above it, because if you hold control and hit the G key, it rings the bell. So that was around age 6. I got really excited about ringing the bell on the teletype. So unlike a lot of people my age, I wasn't really scared of computers or nervous about using technology. I was really excited and interested in it. And around age 16 or 17, the Tandy Radio Shack computer came out, the Trash 80. And I used to go into Radio Shack, which was right near my house, and sit there and just play with their computer all day. And they would let me do it because I was making little graphical demonstrations and learning more about how to program in BASIC and stuff like that. So that was kind of my entrance into touching a computer. I got pretty excited about it, and around age 20, I decided I was really going to get involved. So at that point, I started focusing on doing that. I started teaching gifted and talented students how to do programming. That was my introduction to the Logo programming language. At which point I was hired by Terrapin Logo to write the Apple version of the Logo programming language, which I did. And some friends there introduced me to Richard Stallman. I had already written a program for the Apple called Emacs, which was this full-blown version of Emacs, 80 characters across the screen, meta X completion, all that stuff. And I showed it to Stallman, and he said that he wasn't really a good distribution point for it. So I didn't really know what that meant. And then about a year later, he didn't remember me at all. And about a year later, he asked his friends if they knew someone who would be good to work on this new project he was starting out called Project GNU for the Free Software Foundation, which he had just founded. And they said, yeah, Brian, you might be interested. So I went over there to MIT, where I knew lots of people. Well, I'll get into that in a minute, and started working with Stallman. And that was a very exciting time. I wrote GNU Info. That was the first program I'd written in C, and I completed that. And then I wrote another piece of software, which was the Make Info system, for compiling tech info documents into info documents. And for people who don't know about info documents, they're a lot like the World Wide Web. There's structured data and things that you can click on to take you from place to place within inside this directed graph of information. It is the default core manual system for free software Unix boxes. So at any command line prompt, instead of typing man bash, you can type info bash and you get a much better reader. And then my third program that I wrote for him was GNU Bash. So
that's great. What an incredible journey you had, Brian.
Yeah, that was a long-winded one, but it was fun.
So you know, one kind of question I have, this is kind of, I'm curious about this as kind of an open source developer. So how did you get these tools to be so popular? Like, were there any ways that you got the community to embrace this, you know, these projects, GNU itself? Like, were there any strategies that you guys used to get such widespread adoption here?
Yeah. So I was really at the right place at the right time. You know, people talk about, they ask about where did open source, you know, come from or whatever. Open source existed before the open source movement. That was the camaraderie that existed between people who were interested in computer programming. It started off kind of as a hobbyist thing. People would put together their own computers, they'd write some code, then they'd share that information with their friends. Hey, look at this cool thing I did, or this is how you might want to solve that problem. And so it became intellectual currency for discussions. You would sit around and talk about the next new thing, or these things that you could do much better with a computer. Like, you know, at the time that I started programming, the mouse had just kind of started to show up, not for home computers, because we really didn't even have home computers. The mouse showed up for people at Xerox using a bitgraph terminal, which was a bitmap display. No one ever had the idea of a bitmap display. Everything was a VT52 or a standard, you know, stock terminal. So we kept talking about ways in which we could make that more interesting and more exciting, and what's the underlying stuff that makes this work. You know, this stuff that everybody does still now. But the community that grew up around that is actually what we call open source today. And everybody who's a programmer today, I think, really kind of understands that from their gut. You could sit down and write a piece of software because you're trying to make money, but in reality, you like writing software, or why would you be doing it? If you like writing software, you want to share that with other people who also like writing software. So I think it's pretty interesting. So in '84, when this thing got kind of started, we didn't try really hard to promote this open source thing. We did promote free software. We did what was called, I guess, kind of anti-promotion. We'd say, why would you want to be locked into software that you don't own, that you can't modify? Why would you want to buy HP's operating system when you could have your own operating system where you have access to all the code that's in it? And that really resonated with the engineers, and the business people started to understand that the engineers knew what they were talking about technically, so why not go with them? So
that's great, thank you. So so one thing I'm kind of curious about with GNU is, you know, I've noticed that with other kind of open source movements that are more modern today, that there's groups of developers that maintain the projects, and sometimes there's some politics that happen in terms of the maintenance of those projects, in terms of what features get added, what features don't. You know, what do you name the project? You know, do you fork a project? You know, like like for example, in Node.js recently, there was a split where Node.js split into io.js, and they reconciled later. So, were there any political challenges back then? Back when you were first working on these projects at GNU?
Sure, but the political challenges were, so we didn't, it was pretty interesting. Like I said, most of the people who were involved in open source really wanted to share the information about what they were doing. That was the goal, was to find some way to make sure this information could be disseminated and used by everyone. But because part of the reason for sharing is to say, hey, look at me, look how good I am, those egos would get in the way sometimes of actually getting quality work done. So it wasn't that people wouldn't share the information, but they might say, I don't want to take your technical solution because I'm working on a technical solution and mine's probably going to be better when I'm done with it. And you might say, look, I already built an entire thing. You could just, I think today people actually understand that a little bit better. It's like, oh, I can just go to GitHub and grab somebody's project, drop it wholeheartedly into mine, and then if I need to change it or make modifications to it, I can either do that, or if it doesn't really suit my needs, I can write a brand new one. But great, I have the building blocks, I have my Lego building blocks, and I can create something out of it. And I think in the early days, there weren't enough building blocks, and so sometimes there were people who would slow down the progress.
That makes sense. Great. So I was watching another video of you, and you told this great story about globbing and what happened when you introduced that into the bash shell. Can you talk a little bit about that to our audience? I'm sure they'd love to hear the story.
All this. It's really, I'll tell you, I mean, the reason I'm laughing is because there's some really funny things in the story. So I'm writing the shell, and I'm sitting in the AI lab, which is a floor in a large office building. It's an entire floor. The outside ring of the floor is offices that have windows, and then the interior of the floor is bullpens where people hang out with couches and giant floor-to-ceiling wallboards. And I used to hang out in that area with a Sun 3/50, which is a computer that was about this big and it's way less powerful than my iPhone. But it was a Unix box, and that's what I was building software on. So I'm sitting there working on this the shell, and it's time to do globbing. Now, globbing is the part in the shell where, and many people don't really know this, globbing is the part in the shell where all the star.c things get expanded. You end up getting these many file names out of a single pattern. And the shell is responsible for doing the globbing. So if you say ls star, the shell expands that star, and then ls gets all the arguments that match star. ls doesn't take the star and then figure it out. It's kind of silly, it should. So I realized it's time to work on globbing. And while I'm working on globbing, I managed to create a file called *.c, star.c. This is no big deal, you know. I finished doing globbing, I get it all working, and this is a little hack session, so it takes about 3 hours or so. I'm just sitting there writing the glob library. And when I'm done with it, I look at my files in the directory, and I see I have a star.c file, so I want to get rid of it, and I type rm space quote star.c, close quote, and I press return. And then some time goes by. I realize it's taking a long time. That kind of shows you how slow these computers were. Yeah, so I type Control-C, which does work, and it stops doing what it's doing. And I look, and I deleted some large part of the source to the shell because I haven't implemented quoting yet.
That is hilarious.
I actually thought it was hilarious. So, you know, I'd been hacking for 4.5 hours or whatever, and then I just deleted all my work. So I just started laughing, and people were like, "What's so funny?" And I told the story, and they're like, "You should be really upset." I'm like, you know, the hard part was writing it the first time. I can probably write it the second time in 40 minutes. That's just typing. Right?
Is that how long it took you to rewrite it? 40 minutes?
Oh, yeah. Well, because I already wrote it. Right? I already ran into all the bugs and all the problems and all the thought processes that had to be there to make it work, and all the comments that I wrote that made sense of it. It's all sitting right there in my head. So I just typed it back in, basically.
That's great. All right, well, we're going to move on to other topics in a minute. We want to talk about open source voting, also the Free Software Foundation, and also Marvin Mintz a little bit later with you. But for now, let's take a few audience questions about GNU. So the first question with the highest number of votes is, how do you identify and manage technical debt in Emacs and GNU Bash shell?
Well, I'm an old guy. Let me make sure I understand technical debt. Is that bit rot?
I think it's the concept of over time hacks being introduced into code, so that you know, it wasn't written in the ideal way. So the idea is that that's accumulating, but yeah, bit rot is another way to think about it.
Nobody likes this answer. Okay, here's the answer. Don't be lazy when you write it the first time. Now, sometimes external circumstances can create problems for you, right? You know what this is?
What is it? Tell us.
It's a Pony Award, PWNY. The Pony Award is given out for the people who have made the best hacks that can get in and wreak havoc, right?
Are you the recipient of the Pony Award?
I'm a recipient of the Pony Award for the shell shock thing that happened with Bash.
Oh, that is great.
For those of you who don't know what shell shock is, it was pretty popular, pretty well known, and pretty widely talked about a year and a half ago. And it was in the Bash shell, you can pass in the Bash shell, you can have functions. And then it turns out you can pass in environment variables that have as their values functions. You can pass that into a shell that you're starting, so the shell can inherit this function, which is great. It just turned out that if you, for some reason, were running Bash as part of your Apache web server, then externally people could force functions to be passed in to your shell running inside that web server. So a remote attack could take place on any Apache web server running Bash by just inserting a function called ls or whatever it is you want to do, right? And when that code got evaluated, you'd then be running shell code as the Apache user on somebody else's machine. So, of course, the internet exploded. Oh my God, shell shock! The internet's going to die. every machine in the internet, 70 million machines use Bash. It's all going to go to, and of course, nothing ever happened because nobody is running Bash as their web server, right? So this Pony Award was given as the most overrated bug, most overrated exploit that year was shell shock.
That's great. Yeah. Okay, so takeaway point for this question is write it correctly in the first place.
Yeah, literally, don't be lazy, because technical debt, in the way you're talking about it, technical debt is my comment says to do, right, and then I never go back and finish my to-dos. That's the actual way you get technical debt. But if you start from scratch, think about, this is the problem I want to solve. It's exactly this problem. And then write an architecture, deliver an architecture intellectually that solves that problem, and write your code honestly to solve that problem. There's no technical debt. That's how you know when you're done, when you've solved the problem that you defined. The external circumstances can change. The internet can suddenly exist, and web servers can be everywhere, and and Linux can be super popular, and it can be 27 years after you wrote a piece of software, your third, C program ever on the planet, and then maybe bugs will show up. But in general, if you're really focused on solving your specific problem space, you don't accumulate debt. That's a business thing that happens. That's when your manager yells at you, hurry up and get that thing done. I don't care about your security concerns, or I don't care about whether that model is correct. Just make it work. That's when you get debt.
That's a great answer. Thanks. Okay, so I'm looking through the list of questions here. We'll take one more that's related to GNU and Emacs and Bash. So there's two questions I see that are high on the list. One of them is, why Emacs over Visual Studio, Eclipse, IntelliJ, etc.? Another developer asked Emacs or Vim. And then I'm going to add to that by saying, how do you think those compare to the cloud IDEs like Coding and Cloud9, all those guys? Like, what do you think about this whole space now that some time has passed?
Okay, first of all, let me start with Emacs or Vim. Vim is a text editor. Emacs is an IDE. I'm just saying, it's much more like that. First of all, I can program Emacs in Emacs, right? So this is not about key bindings. It's literally about what's the function of this tool. The function of Vim is to edit files. The function of Emacs is to help you manage your development process. So in that way, Emacs is a lot closer to quote unquote Visual Studio or Xcode or any one of those other really horrible, confusing, poorly written, and poorly conceptualized IDEs. Not that I have a strong opinion on this. So I hope I've answered that question in a way that kind of makes sense.
I think you have.
Your next question was about cloud IDEs. I'm actually, surprisingly, a little bit of a fan of cloud IDEs. I think that it's a great way for programmers who are experimenting with stuff to get started. Almost all your code is going to run on the web anyway. Why aren't you using the web to actually build that code? I'm actually okay with that. I mean, I like things like CodePen, CSS Deck, JS Bin. Actually, I have a list of the things that I like. I like those things because I think they make it easier for people who are starting out. They don't have to understand all of the underlying infrastructure in order to do what they really want to do, which is kind of program things on the web.
And why do you like them more than desktop, more heavyweight IDEs like Visual Studio and the like?
Well, the first thing is, like I said, the applications people are writing are not really running on your desktop anymore. They're running in your browser. Your browser is the new paradigm for the desktop, and I don't really care about the underlying operating system. Hence, Chrome OS, right? You can live and survive on Chrome OS. You don't have to have Mac OS Finder or Windows or any of that stuff. You could just have Chrome OS and be able to write software and read email and do graphics. You can kind of do anything you want. And all we're looking at is a browser with code that runs cross natively, if you will. So to run it doesn't care about the underlying processor because the underlying processor is a JavaScript engine.
Makes sense. Okay, great. Thanks. So let's move on to the next topic, which is open source voting. This is a topic that you're particularly passionate about. So I think the way to start this conversation is to talk about the problem. So what problems do we have today with voting?
I want to talk about this, but I don't want to lose the momentum I have on this T-shirt question.
Oh yeah, there's a T-shirt question.
T-shirt was given to me. T-shirt was given to me by Jay Freeman, also known as Sorek, the author of Cydia. Cydia is the application that does package management on jailbroken phones. If you jailbreak your phone, the first thing you do is touch Cydia, and then Cydia tries to load all the packages, and what you see is this, reloading data and a spinner while it goes and gets the packages. So your initial experience with Cydia used to be, it's changed now, used to be this. Jay's a very good friend of mine. I met him in 2000, I think 2001. And we worked together. He worked for me, and then later we worked together. And I gave him an iPhone, and then the rest is history, as we like to say. So anyway, that's where I got this shirt. And then I had some other shirts made which are related to jailbreaking and open source. And I only had about 10 of those, and I gave Jay one. So sometimes when Jay and I hang out together, he wears my shirt and I wear his. So I thought I would wear this today.
So
okay.
Can we order that shirt somewhere?
I don't know. You know, I don't know. Go to sorekit.com and see if that's for sale there.
That might be an interesting side project, you know, after the Hack Summit.
Let me put it this way. Please buy these T-shirts from Jay Freeman, whether they're for sale or not. Send an email and say, I want one of these T-shirts. How much are they? Okay.
All right. You heard it today at the Hack Summit. A call out to Jay Freeman for these shirts.
Yeah.
Great. All right. So open source voting.
Open source voting.
So what are the problems? Like, give us a quick overview of what are the issues that you're seeing today with voting systems?
Okay, so here's the real deal. Today, if you go to cast your vote, you walk into a polling center. They'll give you a paper ballot. You secretly fill out your paper ballot. Ta-da! You go over to the place where you're supposed to deposit your ballot. You hand it to somebody, and they literally put it into a black box, and that's the end of that. And I don't know what that black box is doing. It was made by Diebold or somebody else who's trying to, you know, who's counting my votes. And I don't know how well the software is written that's going to count votes. I mean, actually, I know it's not written well, because it sometimes doesn't do a good job. I don't know whether there are holes in the system that would allow a malicious and clever hacker who's completely outside of the election system to go in and change the way the votes are counted. I don't know if the votes are stored in a database, which is now available to various administrators at the election systems, and they can go in and change the counts. I don't know any of those things. It's not transparent to me, and I can't validate or get some kind of comfort level that that software will do what it's really supposed to do. So the first thing I want in voting software is transparency. I want the entire system from beginning to end to have enough transparency that I can validate the software that's running is software that millions of people can look at and vet. The same way Linux is software that millions of people can look at and vet. And it doesn't mean that everybody has to be an expert at it. The NSA wrote security code for Linux, which is great. Now we have Sec Linux, which is fantastic. But doesn't mean everybody could have written it, but everybody can look at it and decide whether the NSA is ripping them off or stealing things or getting their passwords, and they can say we don't want this particular piece in our operating system. So that's the need for open source and transparency in voting. And I believe open source is the exact way to get that. Free software and open source. I believe that we need end users to be able to look inside and validate what's happening inside of our election systems. I mean, honestly, the right way to do this is everybody raise their hand if you believe blah, and then I just count all the hands instantly. That would be perfect, right? And so we're moving forward down that path. I'm closely connected. I'm an advisor to a company called Follow My Vote, which is sponsoring an open source project for blockchain-based voting. It's very interesting and very exciting. We're communicating with all the right people in the blockchain area. We're talking with the chairman of blockchain.org, and we're talking with the city of San Francisco, who's interested in rolling out an open source voting system. I'm also heavily connected with, as you know, NAVO and CAVO, that's the National Association of Voting Officials, and the California Association of Voting Officials. You can find out more about both of those at navo-us.org. See, this time I got the URL right. navo-us.org. So please go there and check it out to find out more about what we're trying to do and what we're really trying to achieve. And what we want is honesty in elections. We're totally nonpartisan. I mean, I have my own political views, but this project is totally nonpartisan.
Yeah, I mean, I remember the whole fiasco when Al Gore ran for president of the United States with the hanging chads and all that nonsense, right? And it was like a 500 vote difference for the outcome of the U.S. president. And there are so much error-prone systems being used back in the day and still today. So, you know, that a system like that could have altered the course of history, the United States, I think.
You said it. You couldn't have said it better than me. You said that there's a 500 vote difference. Who knows how it happened? There's 500 vote difference. There's 11,000 people on this conference right now. Hey, all you 11,000 people, if you're of an age to vote, go vote. Go vote. When it's time to vote, go vote. Your vote counts in a very big way.
Well said. So let's talk about some of the implementation and political challenges with getting this idea through. So I guess the first thing that comes to mind is, you know, in general, governments are not known to be as forward-thinking as we would like private industries to be sometimes. And so what would you say to a government where they're thinking, well, you know, this whole idea of open source, you know, blockchain, all that stuff is, you know, it's risky, it's new, it's too bleeding edge. Like, how do we overcome the political challenge? It seems like this is less of a technology challenge and more of a political challenge. So how do we move to the next milestone politically here?
The next milestone politically inside of open source. The much like our governmental system, the way we overcome this, and this I'll call political bit rot, the way we overcome it is by having the people who are being affected be more involved. So you're doing great work by what you're doing right this instant, by having 11 or 12,000 people be in a conversation and a dialogue about open source is the right thing to do. These are the people who are going to create open source, not Brian Fox, the only guy at the top, or DHH or Yehuda Katz. We're not the creators of open source. Everybody that's on this call is a creator of open source, and that's important, and people should internalize that and realize it. You don't have to be. It's not siloed. It's flat. Everyone can contribute, and the more people that contribute, the better off the world is. GitHub is doing a great job. Angular, the number of people who have contributed to Angular, the number of people who have contributed to Rails, that's the kind of thing that makes a project, an open source project, actually succeed and makes real change in technology.
Great. So now, are there examples of governments that have started to explore this? Maybe not in the US, but in other countries?
I believe Brazil is 100% open source inside the government. The Netherlands, I think, is 100% open source in the government, not to mention they had an open source voting system that they used. I think Germany had a mandate to make all of their governmental, all the bureaucracy people use only open source. I mean, literally eschew Microsoft. So you can use open office documents and Linux desktops and that.
Great. That's so inspiring to see that's actually working in those countries. Those could be a case study for other countries.
Exactly. And the amount of money that is saved, the amount of money that you're saving a taxpayer, because the government belongs to the people on this call, they're the ones paying taxes. The amount of money that can be saved by moving away from proprietary systems into open systems is substantial. But much more importantly, I'm not a fan of Microsoft. And people say, oh, you hate their fiscal practices, or you think they're evil because they're wealthy. None of those things are true. I'm not a fan of Microsoft because they made bad software acceptable. For a long time, everybody knows what the blue screen of death is. Everyone knows that. Everybody expects your machine to crash. Everybody knows what the three-fingered salute is. It's how you reboot your Exchange server. And yet that became the de facto standard for software. And that disturbs me. Software needs to be better than that. We don't need to have public products out there that people are using that have technical debt in them because they were managed by a closed source company where people were able to get away with that. If you look at source code from closed source companies, you'll see things that just frighten you. You'll see copy and paste everywhere. The code that runs in your car, I can tell you, has copy and paste everywhere. And that means we're taking chunks of code that may not even have an applicable meaning in this other function and just pasting it there because it prints the letter B. That's what we wanted. So it doesn't really matter that it's also as the brake controller. You know, people just copy and paste because that's what they need to do in order to hit their deadlines. You can't do that in open source because everybody reads your code. So don't be lazy, because someday Brian Fox is going to read that line of code and go, God, that guy's so lazy.
Great. So let's talk real quick about Microsoft for a second. So do you think that Microsoft has kind of improved their stance over time? Because I noticed recently that they created this Chakra project, which is essentially like a Node.js runtime, and they've started to contribute back into the Node.js core. So I think that Microsoft more recently started to embrace open source and started to shift. So are you happy to see that transition?
I'm certainly happy to see any transition that brings a closed source software company into an open source software company. It's clear and been proven widely by companies like Red Hat and even Apple. Lots of arguments about Apple, but still, even these companies are utilizing open source and benefiting from it. And we, the consumers, are benefiting from that. So I'm happy to see Microsoft working in an open source way and contributing to open source. I mean, you know, they're a little late to the game, but it's okay. I'm glad you're here. Come on in. Let's go.
Great. Yeah, I am too. Yeah, I actually, I was actually very impressed when I saw those inroads. So I hope that continues. So we actually have an audience question here related to open source voting, which is, when do you think we'll have a cloud-based open source political voting / election system? So, you know, maybe this question is referring to the United States, for example. So like, we'll be realistic for like, you know, for a country like the US, you know, politically to adopt something like this, given all the lobbying that happens and all the special interest groups from the proprietary voting systems that may oppose this, right? You know, given all those political barriers, what's your prediction for this? When is it going to be a reality?
Okay. 100% in 2020 general election if Bernie Sanders is elected.
So it all depends on this election, basically.
The outcome of this election will definitely determine the acceleration of open source in government.
Wow. So this election really matters for the future of elections.
Remember, get out there and vote.
All right. Well, your biases have been stated. I think we all know where you stand now.
I do actually believe that. I believe that if we put people who are focused on keeping the business, keeping the I won't say the top 1%, but keeping the kind of wealthy business owners in business, those people don't have an open mind yet about how to bring open source into the world and let it work well. And because of that, it really stifles the acceptance of open source in places where you wouldn't normally see it. And I think that's kind of nuts. I think open source should be everywhere. There's really no reason to have source code be proprietary in that way. Doesn't mean you can't have companies that make money. We do have companies that make money, but we can really make advancements much faster if we can get the 300 million people that live in the US contributing. Great.
Are there any questions off the audience list that you want to answer before we move on to chatting about the Free Software Foundation?
You asked about code IDEs, about online IDEs, and I wanted to say that there's a service out there that one of my partners is working on that makes it really easy for people who are working with, people who are creating open source in these code IDEs to kind of instantly publish them. So one of the issues that happens is a beginner gets out there, or somebody who's not savvy in all the realms of the things you need to do to deploy an application. They start writing an application in JavaScript, CSS, HTML, and so forth, and it looks pretty good, and they want to share it with their friends, and that means they have to find a place where they can host it and make that URL available to people. Well, there's now a brand new service out there called push2.io, which works with a wide range of these online IDEs to help you just basically push a button and publish it. It's free to publish any one source, any one item. There's a fee if you're an enterprise and you want to kind of do this for your entire development team and have them publish hundreds and hundreds of things. But so you guys might want to check that out. Push2.io.
Push2.io. Everyone, please check that out. I think that'd be a great service for everyone.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll just take the top 2 questions off the list before we move on. So suggestions for beginners. I guess this question might reference, if you're a new programmer, if you're new to open source, how do you get started?
The easiest way to get started in open source is to contribute. Find your own itch and scratch it. Do not try to find a problem that needs to be solved because you think other people care about it. If you don't care about the problem, your solution won't be very good. So you need to care about the problem. Let's say you're using one of these. There's an open source JavaScript editor out there I just saw, which I thought was really cool. I'm sorry, I don't have the name stuck in my head, but if somebody says it, I get it. It's an open source JavaScript editor out there. Apparently, it's quite good. I looked at it and used it a little bit. I thought it was kind of sexy. You can have Emacs bindings if you want to be familiar that way. You can have VI bindings and use it that way. It supports over 100 languages, and it does code highlighting and all that stuff. It's great. If you're using that editor to write code and it doesn't do something you want it to do, then make it do that thing. Write some software that makes it do that thing. You can learn easily from looking at other people's open source in the comments, especially for a larger project like that that's more established, or larger projects like this more established that has lots of examples of how to add functionality to it. So go ahead and add a small amount of functionality. And if you did that, every 3 days for every project that you liked, at the end of 6 months, you would be a prolific open source contributor and everybody would know who you were.
Great answer, thanks. Okay, so, and then the next question off the list, are there any good books or sources that you might suggest to us, sir? So the sir is very important.
Oh, thank you. As far as writing computer software, the fundamental books that they give you in college matter. The Dragon compiler book is fantastic. Learn to program in Scheme. To take some time and learn to do that. Other than that, I would say literally look at these open source projects. I keep talking about GitHub, and I have no affiliation with them and whatever. But I think it's a fantastic resource. Just start searching for things you're interested in. Maybe you're a game developer and you want to know how somebody made a board game. Great, go find a board game on GitHub and look at it, and you'll see how they did it. It doesn't mean that they did it perfectly, but it starts to get those juices flowing. Understanding architecture is the #1 key to writing good software. If you don't have an idea, if you don't have the building blocks and a semantic language for solving that problem, you're going to flounder. So pick something bite-sized so you can understand, the complete understanding of it, and write a solution for it. And I think that will help you fall in love with open source.
So, on this note, we've actually started to poll the audience here. Audience, you can see this on the polls tab of your window, and Brian might want to check it out too. So we've actually been asking the audience as you've been speaking to find out about them, like who are we talking to here? And it looks like out of the audience members, we've got 42% have actually made a contribution to open source, and only 13% have not contributed. Oh, the number's going up as the poll occurs in real time. Okay. But it still is a significant portion who said yes. And then a lot of people who say no, but I really want to, which is really inspiring, I think.
Well, here's the thing that's really interesting. So it's like, I don't know, 2 to 1 people have contributed to people who haven't, but it's even people who have contributed to people who really want to. Hey, if you really want to, come on in, the water's fine. Just contribute. I know there's something that you're using on your computer that you think, oh, this is really good, but if only it did that. Well, that's the thing you should do. Make it do that. And it doesn't matter how simple it is. It doesn't have to be anything. If you think that the font that was used for the headline is wrong because you're a good designer, fix the font. If you think that they didn't, put the right menu option in there, add the menu option. If more people agree with you, if lots of people agree with you, it will find its way into that product that you're using, and you will have contributed substantially to an open source project.
That's great. By the way, Brian, if you want to poll the audience, we can ask them a question from you too later. So think about that. And then the other question here is, how long have you been programming for? So the majority of our audience has actually been programming for quite a while, 6+ years. However, there is a significant percentage of our audience that's newer as well. Yeah. So I think we've got a very sophisticated audience here, Brian.
It seems like it. I mean, here's a question. How many people in this audience have been programming for 30+ years?
All right. You want me to make that poll?
I'm actually really curious about that.
How many audience members have been programming for 30 plus years? But this will show up a little bit delayed because the video chat delay.
It's fine.
Right. Good.
Okay. Now I see another question up here, which I'll talk about. People say, how do I dive into open source? I've been talking about that pretty endlessly, so I don't have to say it again. And how to make it for a living. And that's really interesting. I think there are so many different possible models that you can you can do to make a living at open source that all you have to do is open your mind and think about them. There's a guy in the UK who's working on important pieces of open source software. Of course, like everyone else, he has a real job, i.e. it pays money. And then he has this job where he loves building this open source software product that people are using. And so he says on his website, I need 5,000 euros a month. Right now, I'm asking people to donate a monthly subscription, donate monthly for me to work on this project. And so far, he's got about 3,000 euros a month. Well, if enough people donate, then he'll have 5,000 euros a month, and he won't have a real job. His job will be 100% working on this open source project, which, as you know, it's a passion and the thing that he loves. So he'll put 100 hours a week into that, and this thing should just grow and explode, and he can build a real stronger community around it and everything. And enough people liked it that they voted with their dollars to give him money every month. So I thought that was a very novel way to approach open source. Another way to make a living with open source is build your software that does something valuable, open source it, and run a company that services businesses that need that. So if you wrote an accounting system and it was open source, you could then have the open source accounting system service, and people will hire you to come install that software, customize it more for their business, to help them set it up and manage it. They will hire you as a consultant. They will pay you monthly on retainer to be around, because paying you $1,000 a month to manage their stuff is way less than hiring an IT guy for $10,000 a month and having him manage the stuff, and it's way less than buying a proprietary piece of software that doesn't do what they want, that they have to pay maintenance fees on. So that's another pretty common, straightforward model.
Okay, great. So while the audience answers these polls, let's move on quickly to the last two topics, Free Software Foundation and then Marvin Mintz. So briefly on the Free Software Foundation, you were the first employee, correct, of the Free Software Foundation?
Correct, yes.
Kind of spearheaded by Richard Stallman, also known as RMS,
Yes.
who kind of is a pioneer in having software be free. And obviously, GNU and the Free Software Foundation has made a substantial impact to developers around the world, and I'm very grateful that initiative existed. With that said, there were times where Richard Stallman and the Free Software Foundation were known to be a little bit controversial and edgy with some of the views. So I was kind of wondering, did you ever encounter challenges in that regard? Were there ever misalignments between yourself and Richard? Was it ever kind of differences of opinion in terms of how you saw the world, and how do you guys tackle the feedback that some community members would give regarding their perspective on your views of the world?
Richard Stallman, let me say this up front. Richard Stallman is a friend of mine. I like him very much. I want only the best for Richard Stallman, and that's the way I've felt since the day I met him. He's spent days at my house. We've done a lot of hanging out, and I find him a fascinating individual. He is driven by intellectual curiosity and by emotional stances. And sometimes for people who are so driven for a specific cause, and where the core stemmed from emotional beginnings, sometimes they can't make a separation between, wow, this is 90% of what I'd hoped I'd get. And they continue to argue vehemently about that last 10%. But Richard is one of those people who, although the entire world has moved into open source, he still has a strong distinction in his mind between free software and open source software. He feels like If it's not 100% of his original vision, it's not good enough. And I respect that he has those feelings, but it does, and it has created controversy in the past, and much worse, it has sidelined Richard from the open source community. People view him as difficult to work with and difficult to please. In some ways, because he's difficult to work with and difficult to please. But we lose this intellectual giant, and I mean intellectual giant. I'll tell the story super brief. I went to lunch with Richard and a friend of his who was a PhD candidate in philosophy. The guy was in the middle of writing his thesis, and he had come to a very sticky point in his thesis, and he'd been trying to solve it for several months. And we just went out to eat lunch, and the guy says, "Yeah, I'm kind of stuck on the spot." And Richard says, "Oh, well, tell me about it. Tell us about it." So the guy explains the problem, and then Richard says, "Well, why don't you solve it like this?" and gives him his solution to his PhD philosophy problem.
Wow.
Yeah, I was like, okay, that's different. So we need that kind of intellect of producing things, and we need the passion that he has for correctness involved also. And so I'm glad he's still involved, but I am sorry that people don't realize I don't think people really understand the depth of the contribution that he and others of us at the very beginning made to kind of get open source rolling. But mostly it was by people like David Vinayak Wallace, known as Gumby, Michael Tiemann, who is now at Red Hat. But those guys started a company called Cygnus, and Cygnus was an acronym that stood for Cygnus is your GNU support. And they made open source software affordable, and they did it by charging $100,000 a year contracts, and they became an extremely successful company that was built 100% on open source. They hired all kinds of people to work on open source, and all those people went on to build brilliant open source products and are spearheading different projects now. And so, and those guys, I met Gumby at MIT. Gumby was 17. He was getting a degree in history, but he was at the AI lab and he was killing it over there. So anyway, so the people like those people are real heroes in the commercial world, and I believe that Richard Stallman is a real hero in the spiritual world, if you will. And I'd like people to recognize that more.
Absolutely. I've actually noticed that pattern among entrepreneurs as well. So I've noticed that some of the most successful, incredible entrepreneurs in the world are brilliant, but they also have some other aspect of their personality that they may be compensating for with their brilliance.
Right.
And so they tend to be a little bit unbalanced sometimes. And when I first started, helping startups, I thought, well, I'm only going to look for balanced individuals to help. And then what I found was that some of the most successful organizations actually started with people who were unbalanced because they were geniuses in a lot of ways. And over time, they would hire into other roles to help balance out the team to compensate for their imbalance. So now I don't even look for that anymore when it helps startups. I'm open to the idea of an unbalanced individual who's a genius. That's sometimes where the best projects start.
Yeah, a little manic helps sometimes. Absolutely.
Yeah. So we got the answer to your poll here, by the way.
I think people don't understand something. They think Linux, for example, Linux is fantastic and it's everywhere, right? I mean, Linux is a beautiful thing. Torvalds would never have written Linux if we hadn't gotten as far as we got with Project GNU. He would not have seen that as the thing that was missing that would then give him a viable operating system, because he'd have to go back and write every utility on his own and all the fundamental stuff, compiler, editor, everything. But he had all that, so he was like, maybe I can just write a kernel, and that's fantastic. He did a brilliant job of completing one of the pieces that was not being completed by the Free Software Foundation due to political reasons. And he did a wonderful job getting that done. But without the foundation, without the Free Software Foundation and Project GNU started by Richard Stallman, that would never have come to pass, and we'd all be using Microsoft. Sorry, Bill Gates. You're doing great work too with your foundation, you and your wife.
So, by the way, the audience poll has come in. Mm-hmm. About 18% of our audience has programmed for 30 years or more.
I love you all.
And 82% are new. Do you love the other 82%?
I love everyone. I love everyone in this audience from a conceptual standpoint. Thank you so much for being involved in open source and making open source what it is today. This is open source, and I am excited and thrilled to be here. And I'm also excited and thrilled to see that there is this large contingency of people who like me have been programming for a long time and are involved in open source. And I assume that many of these people have been involved in open source since they've been programming, basically. So that's an exciting thing for me.
Absolutely, yeah. Where the Hack Guide project that we actually just announced, this online knowledge base for programmers, that's actually my first foray kind of into making a project open source, and I'm very excited about it myself. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing the community reaction out of that, and seeing how how our journey goes with open source. And Pluralsight's very excited about that as well.
Yeah, awesome.
So before we wrap up, I want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about Marvin Mintz for a few minutes, because with Marvin Mintz recently deceased, I think we need to pay him some tribute here. And I understand you were a close friend of Marvin, so maybe you can help the audience understand who Marvin was, a little bit more about his background, and what we can learn from Marvin.
Marvin, as everyone knows, externally, everyone knows Marvin was a brilliant individual. The people that knew him knew that he was also a very kind person, that he was very emotionally connected, which was unusual for someone who was so driven by his intellectual side, but he was extremely emotionally connected. One of the things that I think people could really take away if they've been around Marvin at all, and unfortunately I strive for this, but I'm not there. He approached everything, every concept in the world with fresh eyes. He didn't assume anything. And an example, a really straightforward example of this is he used to have in his office just a glass terminal, so it didn't have it wasn't bitmapped or anything. Glass terminals, an Ann Arbor Ambassador, which was oriented in portrait mode, so 60 lines of text. And I walked into his office, and he said, "What do you think of this?" And he shows me his terminal. And I said, it's fine, looks like a terminal. And he goes, "Yeah, watch." And then he types something, like, list directory or whatever. And the cursor wrapped from the bottom back to the top of the screen, leaving all the text where it was, and printed out the directory listing at the top of the screen. I said, "Well, why did it do that? Why didn't it scroll?" And he said, "Why should it scroll? This way, the stuff that I just typed is still where I typed it." So he was completely willing to change the paradigm, the well-understood, well-working paradigm of how scrolling terminals work, to the extent that he implemented a different change and lived with it to find out if it was a better way to do it or not. And that's the way he approached everything, from getting his PhD in mathematics, to starting the artificial intelligence lab, to communicating with people about how they felt the brain worked about emotion. That's, to me, that is a bit of Marvin Mintz that I was, and I don't normally use this word, blessed to see, and it's fantastic. And I love Marvin. I'm very unhappy that he's gone.
Well, thank you, Brian. I really want to pay tribute to Marvin and his contributions here today. So, audience, please feel free to reach out to Brian. Brian, are you going to be available, by the way, to chat more about Marvin and some of the other topics you're passionate about
Sure.
to our audience? Great. So I'm going to go ahead and end the session. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy and paste the Hangouts link that Brian is in for our audience to join. Feel free to chat more with Brian about Marvin, open source voting, GNU Bash, any topic you want to. There is a limit, I believe, of 10 people or so per Hangout. Yeah. So there might be some challenges with everyone getting in, but we'll try to accommodate as many people as we can. Brian, it's such a pleasure to talk with you today. I learned a lot. I'm really grateful for you carving out the time. I know how busy you are. So thank you so much for being part of this today.
Oh, thank you for having me. This is great. I love it. I'm looking forward to the next one.
Great. Okay, thanks, Brian. Now, audience, a couple takeaway points before you leave. So in a few minutes, we're going to be here with the founder of Heroku, Orion Henry. And Orion Henry is going to be giving a great presentation. So it's going to be a thrill to have him here. And in the meantime, if you have a few minutes, check out hack.guides. We'd love to get your feedback on that project. You can click the button in the window to learn more about that. or check out the Hack Pledge at hackpledge.org to volunteer to be a mentor. Okay, thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
Okay.